The philosophers, theologians, and mystics of the ancient world developed a shared, though quite divergent, notion that the ultimate being, the one beyond all being, was in fact distinct from the being that created all of this, the physical cosmos, including the stellar and terrestrial worlds. That entity, the one responsible for the creation of the cosmos, was often denoted as the demiurge in Greek, or the craftsman or artisan, a concept ultimately reaching all the way back to the Timaeus of Plato. However, this concept was genuinely rich and diverse. From the divine and yet limited by matter demiurge of Plato to the creative logos of Philo and Proto-Catholicism, all the way over to the nightmare creator in the form of the Sethian demiurge Yaldabaoth and his demonic planetary archons. Yet one of the concepts of the demiurge stands out as especially beautiful, optimistic, even sublime: the Hermetic Demiurge. Taken from the teachings of the synthesized teacher Thoth Hermes, the Hermetica taught that our human nature was fundamentally divine. One only had to realize that truth in the practice of reverence and ethical life. But in the pages of the Hermetica, we learn that the cosmos too is an expression of the beauty, the goodness, and the sublimity of the luminous one beyond all being. Far from being a prison guarded by a psychopathic demiurge of the Sethian Gnostics, the Hermetic Demiurge is an expression and expresses the cosmos as goodness, harmony, and beauty, as an extension of the will and reason of that light beyond all light. Let's explore the Hermetic Demiurge. Make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica for weekly explorations and topics in esoteric history. And if you'd like to support this work of providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible content like this episode, then I'd hope you consider supporting the channel by checking out our Patreon or buying some of the cool merch we have available. If you're new to the study of esotericism, you should make sure to check out our study guide, which will give you a reliable lay of the land for the literature available. And if you're interested in actual historical books on topics in the occult and the mystical, check out our rare book business over at Esoterica Rare Books. You can find all those links in the description and in the pinned comment below. But now, let's turn to the Hermetic Demiurge, the solar creative power of harmony, of beauty, and of goodness in and as the cosmos itself. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. As you might have guessed, this episode is part of my ongoing series on the ancient concept of the demiurge. That is, the secondary entity from a benevolent god to an ignorant demon, responsible for the creation of all of this, the cosmos, inasmuch of the ancient philosophy, religion, and esotericism in the first centuries of the Common Era had developed. So far we've covered the concepts of the origin of the demiurge in Plato, the demonization of Yahweh, the Israelite God, by their identification with the Egyptian god Set, the ignorant but ultimately redeemed emanation of Sophia of the Valentinian Gnostics, and his much more classically evil counterpart, Yaldabaoth or Samael in the Sethian mythology. Further, we've explored the evil creator in Marcionite Christianity who was opposed to the truly divine God in Christ. In other cases, angelic creators who entrap divine wisdom in the theology of Simon of Samaria, and much else besides in this series. If you're interested in the history of the concept of the demiurge, make sure to check out those previous episodes in order to get a lay of the land for this one. But in this episode, I want to turn to what might be the diametric opposite position to those of the Sethian Gnostics, whose concept of the demiurge was marked by that profound, chaotic, vampiric evil, to the one of the Hermetic Demiurge, marked as a cosmocrator of benevolence, harmony, beauty, and goodness. Indeed, this may be one of the most optimistic concepts of the Demiurge in antiquity. Even the proto-Catholic Demiurge, the divine Christ Logos, still provided ultimately over a fallen world, which would be ultimately purified in apocalyptic fire, whereas the cosmos itself is a kind of divine body, with space itself an extension of the divine mind in the Hermetic cosmology. So indeed, along with the Stoics, this may be one of the most optimistic metaphysics in the ancient world. But what was Hermeticism? It's extant in a substantial collection of ancient literature, and Hermeticism expresses an ancient Greco-Egyptian synthetic theory of salvation expressed in the language of Greek philosophy. It likely had its origins in the priestly Egyptian class. This theory of salvation taught that the human being was ultimately an expression of a luminous divine, which is the ground of all reality. But in the process of embodiment, the soul becomes enmeshed in erotic love, such that the physical body is implanted with all manner of daimonic astral forces, which become fate. They fate the body to dissolution. These daimonic forces ultimately delude us into taking physical appearances as real, as opposed to the true reality, that is, the expression of the luminous one beyond all being. Thus, through moral living, initiation into the Hermetic teachings, and especially reverence of the divine, one can ultimately purge these daimonic influences. One can obtain brief visions of the true divine nature of reality through our higher consciousness, our Nous, and ultimately transcend the physical world to return to our true origins in the divine light. Now, I've done lots of content over the years on this channel if you want to check out deeper dives into Hermeticism, Hermetic literature, and the transformation of Hermeticism, especially during the Renaissance and the early modern development of the occult philosophy. Also, there are lots of really great introductions and deeper dives on Hermeticism across the landscape of ReligionTube if you want to check those out as well. But what about the Hermetic Demiurge? Well, this is where the fundamental nature of Hermeticism as primarily a means of salvation makes telling that story a bit challenging, to be honest. Hermeticism was never a coherent, systematic school of philosophy. Rather, practitioners of Hermeticism seem to have employed Greek philosophical language to express ideas, but their fundamental interest was always, first and foremost, in salvation. In fact, the Hermetica often just mocks Greek philosophy as bandying around empty concepts which lack energy as the texts have it. They aren't really philosophers, they're not really lovers of wisdom, but they are philosophers, lovers of noise, as the Hermetica has it in a funny Greek pun. Thus, the Hermetic insists that we not lose the forest for the trees, philosophical deductions for the real point of it all, for salvation. And thus, from Hermetic text to Hermetic text, we often have a frankly bewildering range of positions on many topics, including the Demiurge, as we're going to see. Indeed, some texts just flatly deny any such Demiurge could exist at all in the Hermetic system, while others insist that the divine Sun is the Demiurge, Sun, S-U-N. This manifest conduit through the cosmos is, in fact, begotten, organized, and blessed by the divine light. So we're dealing with a polyvocal tradition where any discussion of specific positions or doctrines said to be held by the Hermeticists should ultimately be placed in the service of the ultimate aim of their system as much as it is the restoration of the human being as nous, or higher consciousness, back to the source of all such luminous cognition through ritual, education, morality, and above all, by reverence. And to be honest, this is all kind of compounded by what seems to be significant corruption in the Hermetic literature itself, especially some of the key Hermetic tracts that we'll be exploring in a moment. As one is studying the Hermetica, one becomes accustomed to a kind of metaphysical whiplash. There seems to be monistic and an optimistic core to the literature, which is punctuated from time to time with radical dualistic elements. One tractate will have the astral bodies, for instance, and the planets, the benevolent giver of gifts to humankind. Then, in just another tract, they seem to be evil, demonic entities all of a sudden, possessing the nooks and crannies of our physical bodies. In some cases, the physical cosmos is the beautiful and harmonious expression of the ultimate divine reason and will. Then, in other texts, nature is emergent from a moist darkness that entraps the divine human in flesh and blood and bone. What explains these tensions? Well, one possible explanation is that initiates were given a more dualistic teaching early on in the initiation process before the more true monistic teachings were revealed. Thus, we're simply reading documents at various points of the Hermetic initiation, which we know that there were graded texts, simply out of order of that initiation. The texts just aren't ordered the way they're supposed to be read. Well, the problem with this interpretation is that such monism, dualism, metaphysical paradoxes or contradictions as they might be, they actually show up not only between tracks, but inside of singular tracks as they've come down to us. And to deal with these problems, scholars have begun increasingly to see the Hermetic literature, including individual tractates, as the result of centuries-long, millennia-long editorial processes. For instance, Christian Wilberg sees evidence of a pompous yet barely literate, they tend to be the same, dualist astrologer's commentary on the text of Corpus Hermeticum 3, for instance, actually having been incorporated into the text as we have it. It's basically a commentary that's now been built into the text. Thus, what we're looking at isn't a singular unified text, but a kind of literary archaeological site with several, sometimes even contradictory levels. Even seemingly Christians commentarying in the text, mocking Hermetic beliefs, have been built back into the text, all conglomerated into the text and translations of the Hermetica as they've come down to us. Not to mention that what has come down to us has all gone through the filter of Byzantine editors, whose Christian sensibilities no doubt influenced what reached us at all. So, given all of that, what's the true Hermetic position on the Demiurge or salvation? And what are later commentaries, glosses, additions, and alterations, even mocking abuse, now stranded in the text? The answer is we don't totally know, and we won't probably ever totally know. One, because their spiritual commitments to salvation by the Hermeticists seem to have been their priority, and not literary or even mythological, much less logical dialectical consistency. Further, until a true edition of the Hermetica is available, and one is in the works and has been in the works now for about 10 years, scholars and practitioners are going to have to wait to study and debate and negotiate with that text. So at this point, we don't even know what we don't know. Also, and this should give you pause for any would-be Hermetic guru out there claiming to have all the answers about Hermeticism. And in fact, this is one of the places where I really admire many of the contemporary practitioners of the Way of Hermes. They're attempting real fidelity to both the texts and to the spirit of the text, but they're also being radically honest about the fact that what they're doing is a good faith reconstruction. And in my experience, they're willing to admit what can and can't be known from the texts that survive down to us. So any text or teacher or would-be Hermetic guru claiming to know the teachings of Hermeticism and the 7 Hermetic principles or some text revealed from Atlantis, that should be a big, bright red flag. Run. So I want to proceed being honest about the text as we're dealing with them in the Hermetic literature. That future critical edition is going to throw this very episode into disarray. But that's just the march of scholarship. It's admitting what we know and what we don't know, doing our best knowing that it'll be improved upon later. So with all that said, I'm going to try to flag when I'm using a source that contemporary scholarship seems to believe that what we might be dealing with is a later gloss or interpolation into the text according to where scholarship is now. And so we're going to start with the best place to understand the Hermetic Demiurge, the origin of all such being according to this literature, the Hermetic God. The Hermetic divinity is a kind of singular hyper-entity, though to be clear, the Hermetic mythology is primarily monistic, it isn't necessarily monotheistic. And either is the cause of Nous, or higher mind, or simply the higher mind of which all minds, all Nouses, are an expression. the fundamental origin and author of all creation, the divine for whom the cosmos is a manifestation of divine reason, will, harmony, and goodness. The divine goodness is solely that which is good. There's nothing else which is good because that's basically all there is, truly. With all goodness a manifestation of that primal beneficence. But because the cosmos is a manifestation of the divine, it is a kind of second God, in which space itself is just the all-pervading divine mind, or Nous. And yet, while all this can be said about the Hermetic Demiurge, this entity is a kind of hyper-entity, beyond all predication, beyond all cognition, beyond all comprehension, beyond even the concept of being a monad, known only through direct experience via Nous, or higher consciousness, which is ultimately the self-same Nous, which is either the divine or the ground of the divine. But this unity of all being produces a kind of paradox internal to the Hermetica. Some texts reject completely that there could be any kind of secondary creator, any kind of demiurge. But why? Because if there were two creators, they would compete in their creative process, the lower perhaps attempting to produce beings beyond the scope of its power. Further, the singular harmony of the cosmos is taken as proof for a singular author of creation. I mean, we've all done group work before. That all works out great. Thus, some Hermetic tracts deny that there's any such intermediate demiurge-like entity at all. But to appreciate why some texts do in fact introduce a demiurge into the Hermetic mythology, let's turn to some of those creation myths in the Hermetica. And here we face yet another hurdle. You having fun yet? A hurdle. There are several different creation myths to be found in the Hermetic literature. Well, why is that? As I've mentioned, one of the core Hermetic values is that of reverence, or ousia. But if the divine is invisible to our senses, how do we develop knowledge and reverence for that divine? If we've never seen or heard them, how do we develop reverence for the divine? Well, it's precisely by meditating first on the harmony, goodness, and beauty of the cosmos itself as a manifestation of the divine. In a bit of a Platonic way, our senses can ultimately lead us to noesis, knowledge through nous, or higher cognition if driven by our sense of reverence. Thus, the Hermeticists seem to have been interested in creation stories, several of which survive in a relatively small collection of literature, all things told, precisely in order to aid the initiate toward salvation by grasping how they themselves, the cosmos and the divine, are all linked into one vast and sublime totality. So let's turn to the most famous of those creation stories to get some sense of what the Hermetic Demiurge may have made sense in the larger scope of this salvific idea. In both antiquity and since the Renaissance, since Ficino translated the Corpus Hermeticum and basically created a neo-Hermeticism, the Corpus Hermeticum I, the Pymander, has proven to be the most influential work in the entire Hermetic corpus. There we find who seems to be Hermes Trismegistus, receiving a vivid dream vision in which he communes with his nous, or higher consciousness, as a manifestation of that highest reality. In this revelation, and it's really a revelation, Hermes is given a vision of the process by which the cosmos came into being in the first place. There we learn of the primal paternal light giving birth and communing with the divine speech as reason, or the logos. However, there also existed a kind of primal, though ontologically inferior, darkness, which degenerates quickly into a kind of moisture. This may be a bit of an Egyptian idea. The Logos draws the four elements up from the darkness, each finding their Aristotelian natural place in the cosmos. Earth and water at the bottom, air in the middle, and fire rising to the top. Humanity emerges from that primal father, and just in that image, gazing below at the watery depths. Humanity is the image of perfect beauty, of Nous, of the divine parent, and thus nature below erotically craves the image of humanity, and humanity, peering down into that abyss, falls in love with their own beauty and reflection. Thus there is a willed descent, not a fall, a willed descent inspired by erotic desire, in which humanity becomes enmeshed in nature, takes on a physical body, and because of this will, at least physically, comes to cease to exist eventually. Thus, this text has us that Eros is the cause of death. While embodiment is not overwhelmingly negative in the Hermetic literature, the natural body, the physical body, ruled by the forces of generation and corruption, will eventually cease to exist as such. However, the true humanity, the image of the primal light as Nous, it cannot cease to exist. It's eternal. It's God. Death is an illusion in the Hermetic philosophy. There's only dynamism, change. There's a never-ceasing pulse of energy since the beginning, as much as there was one. Thus, the task of Hermeticism is precisely to awaken this such that self-recognition is correctly taken to be self-deification, or theosis, and much of the rest of Corpus Hermeticum 1 is just preaching to the reader of this fact. Wake up from your drunkenness. You're God. And that would be that, aside from what appears to be an addendum at the end of Corpus Hermeticum 1. Seemingly connected to some of the sentiments we found in other texts, we now found a kind of secondary narrative, a second creation story in which another creative entity aside from the primal parent and logos are at work. Here we find a secondary Nous, a god of fire and wind, as a demiurge, as a creative power who rules over the whirling 7 planets, as lords who seem to be malevolent all of a sudden. They will prove to be the origin and receptacle of various evils as one passes back up to the world of light. And in other places, these planetary beings seem to take on a demonic aspect, which infects the body, and which must be shed as one's Nous returns to the primal light. This negative view of the planets is very much in keeping with the Sethian Gnostic idea of the planets as archons or cosmic prison wardens, something alien overall to the tenor of the Hermetica. Indeed, other Hermetic fragments, especially the Stobaean fragments 23 and 29, in those texts the planets are depicted as beneficent, providing gifts, boons to humanity in their descent to nature. Thus, such statements may well be later dualist, Gnosticizing intrusions into a more fundamentally monistic Hermetic ur-text. Thus is actually reinforced by looking at texts like Corpus Hermeticum 11 and Corpus Hermeticum 14, where we learn that the divine is by nature creative, having been creating since eternity. Thus, there is no moment at which creation begins as such, as in the Israelite myth to be found in Genesis, but is always already an eternal profusion of creative energy and activity. Thus, while the world may seem somehow phenomenally real, the creation is in no way separated from the creator, with all goodness in which the world is just an expression of that divine, beneficent creative power by direct creation by the divine via perhaps the Logos, perhaps as a kind of demiurge. But again, here we have a strange combination of a secondary Nous as a kind of god of wind and fire, or Logos kind of conjuring things out of the physical elements. So something like a Logos, but this later text may be a later intrusion. But what of the defects or the evils in the world? Some evils are merely apparent evils to us. They're only defects from our point of view, or simply natural changes by which novelty itself comes to be. Yes, development, change, and eventually dissolution may be a bad outcome for those of us who cling to bodily existence, but they're nothing for the eternal mind, which we really are, and they're in fact grounds for new life, for new creativity and existence itself. Thus, the cosmos is itself a secondary God, as the text has it, an expression of the more primal glory and perfection of the God beyond gods. Indeed, Corpus Hermeticum 14 offers the strongest rebuttal of the idea of any intermediary being, demiurge or not, between the true creator and the cosmos, and in fact dismisses talk of a secondary creator or a demiurge as a flood of nonsensical chatter. Rather, the cosmos is the visible, apparent reality of the divine activity, and thus the divine is rightly known as God, creator, and Father, as the font of all goodness from beyond being. the begetter of all that is and the benevolent caretaker of what is and what shall come. Even the more technically philosophical Corpus Hermeticum 2 tries to convince us that space itself is actually a diffused form of divine nous, or mind. This is a bit like the all-pervading logos fire of the Stoics. However, here, the divine is not to be identified with nous, but said to be the source of the existence of nous, though without any doubt one of the greatest and least appreciated statements of the Hermetic theology is to be found in Corpus Hermeticum 11. Corpus Hermeticum 1 steals the show, but Corpus Hermeticum 11 is really the tour de force from a theological point of view. There we're told of a kind of cascading ontological expression of the divine, such that God makes aion, or eternity. Eternity makes the cosmos makes time, and time makes birth, with the sun an image of the cosmos and humanity an image of the sun, such that everything is connected into one vast totality. Everything is replete with divinity. And yet, the divine is one despite our world of apparent multiplicity. That multiplicity the result of knowledge arrived at through sensation rather than through pure noesis. However, all things have their place in the orderly cosmos, even those apparent things. Indeed, the text enjoys the pun of the cosmos as the world around us, the physical cosmos, but also in the sense of to adorn, to make neat, to decorate in the Greek language. The cosmos becomes a kind of decoration for the divine. It's just lovely. A complete inversion of those philosophies that held that matter to be basically evil, tarnished, and our physical bodies indeed something to be ashamed of, as Plotinus was ashamed of his body. Indeed, this whole tractate can be read as a polemic against such ideas as a fallen, degraded, imperfect cosmos, and thus may be an attack on early Christians, Platonists, and Gnostics alike. Indeed, given the perfection and beauty in the cosmos as an expression of the divine, there's no reason for it to ultimately be destroyed or judged or redeemed. Indeed, there's just no real death, simply the constant cycle of regeneration and destruction born out of the eternity which is the image of the divine. Again, thus making the cosmos the visible dimension of the invisible creator. And by contemplating that beauty with and through reverence, it's possible for humanity to realize that they aren't contemplating something outside them, but God contemplating the divine self through the local region of that divine mind that is you and I, as much as there is a you and an I distinct. It's no wonder that the German Christian mystic Meister Eckhart was saved from being condemned by the Inquisition by his own death, given that he uttered such truly hermetic statements as his famous idea that the eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. My eye, God's eye are just one eye, one seeing, one knowing, and one love. The text even sails to what seem to be magical heights. Since nous just is what truly is, one's nous is not local. It's non-local. And thus one can be in faraway India just as at the same time as one can be in the sands of Egypt. It's all just nous. Our nous is simply a region of the singular divine nous. They're just moments in the bodiless imagination, as the text has it. We're encouraged to, quote, leap out of every body, go beyond time, become eternity, and then you will be conscious of God in this salvific process of theosis. Thus, in general, the Hermetic system seems to most often leave very little room for any kind of intermediate demiurge-like entity. There simply just isn't much metaphysical room, so to speak, for such an entity in the lion's share of Hermetic cosmological speculation. However, Corpus Hermeticum 16 seems to present the most important divergence in this respect. In this text, the divine Sun, S-U-N, the solar being, acts as the Demiurge. This tract, written conspicuously in Greek, complete with Greek puns indicating that was the original language of composition, urges that this tract was never to be translated into that very language from its native Egyptian. Given that the Greek language lacks the metaphysical power of the cacophonous and empty Greek language, it lacks the energy as the text has it. Indeed, the text warns us that it's being written in such a way so as to hide mysteries so that only the wise will detect them. I can't say that I did detect them, but maybe you will. We're then welcomed into the discourse with a prayer before a discourse then on the Solar Demiurge and various astral daimones now discussed at length. What we learn in this remarkable text is that the Solar Demiurge attracts everything to itself and doles out life-giving and sustaining energy, even reaching down into the depths of the ocean where actual light never reaches. In fact, the text seems to assume a kind of strange heliocentric cosmos, with the Earth and the Sun perhaps tidally locked. With the other planets seemingly in motion, perhaps around the Earth, this is a bit like the 16th century solar system of scientist and esotericist Tycho Brahe. This unchanging, life-giving solar deity is also described at Stobaean Fragment 21 as, quote, alone entrusted with crafting everything in the world, with ruling and with making everything. So another example of a Hermetic text with a solar demiurge. Also, the Aesculapius at 29, we're told that the sun is indeed a second god, governing all things and shedding light on all that are in the world, ensouled and yet soulless. Indeed, in Corpus Hermeticum 16, the sun is a kind of container filled with divine nous, a divine chariot enlivening the world and causing and nourishing all that is. Thus, the sun as a second god is a kind of container, conduit, and agent for the divine nous or higher consciousness, the most ontologically primal visible manifestation of the beneficent divine will, the visible divine light of the otherwise invisible true divine light. Then, in somewhat of an abrupt shift, we learn that there are various daimonic battalions arrayed between the sun and the earth, and these enact various natural disasters here on earth, like earthquakes and wildfires and storms and famines and wars. Bad stuff. Big bad stuff. They also punish individual human beings for that especially gravest of Hermetic sins, aesthesia, irreverence. But they're mixed. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, and some of them are a combination of good and bad, but they're given a kind of governorship over earthly affairs. Indeed, we learn that at our birth, they burrow into our bodies, into the various regions of our bodies. Our bodies then, if left unpurified by reverence, ethical, and spiritual trainings, are little more than dreadful marionettes set to dance by hordes of such beings infesting our flesh. Indeed, their control over earthly and bodily affairs is just what the tract denotes as fate. However, our nous is immune from the machinations of these daimones, and thus by learning to perceive through noesis, through nous alone, rather than merely through our senses, we can break free of their influence and ascend back to the solar deity, beyond the planets, depositing into the daimones from which they came, kind of putting them back where they were, before finally returning to the divine light of nous beyond all being. Now, I have to admit that these daimones seem a lot like Gnostic archons. So one wonders if this material, even this whole tract, isn't just that later dualistic Gnosticizing astrologer mucking about in the Hermetic literature again. But to be sure, the association of solar power with divine beneficence and cosmic guidance is absolutely ancient and indigenous to the ancient Egyptians, between the god Ra and the nice idea of the Aten. It's the child of the god and representative of the very principle of intelligibility in Plato. It's associated with divine reason and Stoicism. It's the mind and moderator of the universe at the helm of the whole world for Iamblichus, and variously thought of as the Invictus, the Solus Invictus, the unconquered by the Romans, and associated with Apollo by the Greeks, and even wrapped up in some early Christian representations of Jesus as well. Clearly, the Hermetic literature is tapping the sun as a demiurge is perfectly in character and in keeping with the much wider religious and philosophical discourse of that day. Thus, it seems that this solar demiurge, as conduit of the divine will and reason, sustainer and harmonizer of life, and bestower of light and energy, it does seem to be an authentic depiction of the Hermetic Demiurge. And indeed, perhaps the most optimistic metaphysical theology and theory of salvation in the ancient world. I've included a list of resources for studying further the concept of the Demiurge, Hermeticism, Gnosticism in the description, so make sure to check those out if you want my sources and further reading. But a special shout out to Dr. David Litwa's work, especially his translations of the Hermetica and his YouTube channel, which you absolutely have to check out if you're interested in deep dives into Gnosticism, Hermeticism, early Christianity, etc. So make sure to check all those out if you're interested in topics like these. But no, we're not done with the Demiurge yet. I still want to explore the concept in Middle Platonism, in indigenous Egyptian religion, and the Jewish philosophy of Philo, the Christian development of the concept, especially in Origen, who is one of my favorite early Christian theologians, and further track the concept into its own twilight until the end of the Demiurge in Neoplatonism. So stay tuned and subscribe for much more Demiurge content to come. Until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.